I have just been asked that the microphone is picking up all the background noise too, so just being mindful with any background talking that it's all getting picked up. So, yeah. Okay, autism. Oh shoot, I forgot to look up those videos. I knew I was going to forget something. Let's just talk about autism a little more. So, the parts of the brain involved in autism, and this is where I had to look it up because I never remember these kinds of details. Cerebellum is actually smaller in people with autism, and this is the part of the brain. It works with the frontal lobe, as all the parts of the brain do. It is primarily responsible for motor movement, connects to the parts of the brain that governs attention, arousal, and assimilation of sensory information. So this is where we see those, where their thinking, it results in those stereotypical behaviors and the sensory sensitivities. The limbic system is your emotions, feelings, and moods, and it is also smaller in people with autism. So that would affect their social withdrawal from healthy behaviors and difficulty adjusting to situations. The hippocampus is part of the limbic system, which is smaller and could affect their learning and memory. So there are definite differences in the brain, and this is part of that new brain research on autism. But there's definite differences that result in their autistic behaviors. So the important thing to remember out of this is the neurological piece of it. Like I say, I don't remember this stuff. I always have to look it up if I'm talking about it. And it's not important to know what parts of the brain. It's important to know that you are dealing with a neurological difference, and the kid is coming with a neurological package that we just have to deal with as it comes. I wanted to talk about social cognition, the ability to correctly read and interpret all of the social cues in the environment, including the people, especially the people. But it also takes into account the environment. Yep.
So now those differences in the brain, do they know, is it the autism that causes those differences in the brain, or those differences in the brain that cause the autism?
That's a really good question. I actually think that they're thinking it's the differences in the brain that cause the autism.
Okay.
Because the autism comes out at such an early age, usually. In a lot of autism, and I don't know, I've always wondered if there's different types of autism, because some kids don't show any symptoms at all until they're about 2, and then all of a sudden their development goes backwards. Some kids, you can see the signs of autism in them from infancy, where they're just not as interactive and as engaged with people, and when they start to play, it's very isolated play. So it seems to me, I don't know, to me that would suggest maybe some different causes, different types of autism. They're still looking into the causes, it's still not clear. I think that there's a general belief that there's an environmental component to the cause. So the social cognition, there is a lot involved in social cognition. We have to share our interests with another person. We have to know how to do that. We have to know how to take a turn in a conversation. We know how to use eye contact. Eye contact is a funny thing because sometimes we will say we want, like I've seen goals in IEPs to increase their eye contact. That's not always a really great goal, because if we're just working on more eye contact, we could be making them even more weird. Because if they're staring at you and staring at you and staring at you, that gets weird after a bit. Really uncomfortable. So they have to know when it's appropriate to look at people and not. If eye contact is a huge thing that's very important, sometimes we tell them look at somebody's chin or look at their forehead. Eye contact can be very uncomfortable for them. It can be too much input. They don't know how to read what they're seeing. So why would they look at it? It makes no sense to them, and it's overwhelming. Here's this face that's doing all these funny changes and things. They don't know what it means. Why am I going to look? It's so uncomfortable. So that's when it's a thing like that for them, we get them to look in different places on their head. And we have to think in eye contact in terms of appropriateness rather than amount. So looking, there's times when you look away, when you're having a conversation with someone, you don't fix on their eyes and have the conversation. You look away, you look up. You know, when you're thinking, you tend to look up, right? So it's something to think about. It isn't necessarily a goal. Personally, I don't put eye contact in IEPs. I don't think increasing eye contact is necessarily the best type of goal. I would say more learning how to read the social cues on a person, which will eventually, as they develop some skills in reading social cues, will result in more appropriate use of their eyes. But a lot of them don't really know what they're looking at when they look at eyes. So why, if you don't know why you're doing it, why would you do it? Another important one is reading the needs of the listener and adapting and changing to meet your listener's needs. I talked a little bit before with the language processing about meeting your listener needs. When you're talking, your listener shouldn't have to do all the work. Your listener shouldn't have to be putting the puzzle pieces together. These guys can't meet their listener needs because they can't take the perspective. They don't know what their listener is hearing. Sometimes these guys just assume you saw what they saw. Well, you know that thing we saw on the road this morning. I wasn't there. How am I supposed to know? But they can't read that. They can't say, you weren't there, so you can't know that. I actually heard a guy, an autistic guy not very long ago, who's clearly had some training in, he's a high school guy, I haven't known him very long, but he's clearly had training in learning to think about what other people know and what they don't know. So he starts talking about something he saw, and then he stopped himself, and he thought about it. I mean, this is a really slow process for them. He's had training in this, so he stopped and he thought, and he said, but you couldn't know that because you weren't there. Yes, but it was so slow. Like, I just know that. When I'm talking to you, I know if I start talking about something that happened last night, that I have to give you the whole context for that because you weren't there. But he has to be taught that. So it's a slow, slow process for him. All of this stuff, we can teach them all of these skills that they need, but it's always going to be slow for them because they have to think through it. We use cognitive behavioral type strategies for it, so we're teaching them to be conscious of all these things and work their way through it, and it's slow. Most of us, typical brains, do this in a nanosecond. They never can do it in a nanosecond, and it's always going to be slow for them. So, yeah, I'll get off that strategies. It does include showing interest and understanding the listener. When you are being the listener, what kind of behavior do you do? And what if you're not interested in their topic? Autistic kids can sound off, well, I don't want to talk about that. What do I want to know that for? Well, why are you telling me that? Because they don't get that you have a conversation just for that sharing of interest. Just to, it's a connection. It's a way of making friends. They also don't understand why they don't have friends. They try and look at what other people are doing. They can't really make sense of it. They don't learn by modeling, by the way. They don't learn very well by modeling. Some of the things they can learn some things by modeling. They sure can't learn social cognition by modeling. They are not, they can't imitate very well. Have you guys heard of mirror neurons? I can barely say that. Yeah, mirror neurons? That part of the brain where when someone else is doing an action, our brain responds as if we're doing the action. They're starting to think that mirror neurons are partly what's responsible for that lack of ability to imitate and take the perspective of others in autistic people. So without that ability, then they are not going to, naturally, we're going to think they're not going to be able to learn through modeling. So putting them in a group of kids and expecting them to learn the social interactions just by watching the other kids is not going to work for them. That's why they need the specific instruction in the social space that they need. So initiating social interactions, this is a big one for them. I've seen these kids try hard to initiate, but their initiations are so bad. They're either really like a bulldozer type approach, like they go storming into the middle and sends toys scattering everywhere. Or they're just really awkward, like they just come up to you and start saying bizarre things. And did you see that train on TV? No, that's their initiation. And sometimes you have to think, we know a lot of times they would love to have social connections, but they just don't know how. And sometimes when you see them doing or saying something really bizarre, almost sometimes it can be so rude it looks like a behavior. We have to recognize it when it is an initiation, when they are attempting to make some social contact. That's a good thing. Even if it's not appropriate, the intent is there. We want to grab that intent and do something more positive with it if we can. But it's a hard process. We were just talking about this yesterday because we were talking about teaching that initiation piece, and it's such an involved process. There's something I work on that's watch, move closer, figure out what's going on, make a comment or question, and then join the game. but all the things you need to know in order to be able to do that. So if I'm going to watch, I need to know what I'm watching. I need to be able to figure out, first, do I want to be part of that thing? What is that thing that's going on over there? Second, move closer. How close? You know, do I come this close? Is this close enough? Is this close enough? Like, is this close enough? Like, where is close? How close can I get in this interaction? Comment or question? What's a comment? What's a question? What's an appropriate comment for that situation? What's an appropriate question for that situation? And is it like, how familiar do you get with this? How well do you know these people? It's the complexities of just teaching that joining in process just get bigger and bigger and bigger when you think about it. You have to break down these tasks for these guys. Some of them can do a lot of those things, and you have less to teach. But when they can't do some of those things, it just means you have to teach smaller and smaller increments of the task. Body language, some of them are not bad with body language, some of them are terrible with body language. And it works both ways, reading it and using it. They also, I find, their facial expressions don't always match what they're really feeling. We can't make an assumption about what they're feeling from their facial expressions. We have a fairly low, it's hard to know actually because he's ESL and has huge speech problems, but he's a lower functioning autistic guy. And he giggles and laughs and flaps his arms when he's super stressed out. And the initial thing when he first arrived at the school was, well, he's being a little monkey. He's being silly. We've got to be firm with him. Well, that just increased his anxiety and caused him more stress. He climbs when he's stressed too. So there's stairs in the school. So that was really scary because he could fall off the way the staircase was. So we don't want him to be running around the hall in this highly escalated state. But people were thinking of him because he's got a big smile and he's giggling. They were thinking that he was being a little monkey, that he's pushing our buttons. No, he's stressed out, he's autistic, he doesn't know, what you're seeing doesn't match what's going on inside of him. And, you know, I often see kids, and I don't know why these guys do it, but there's a stress grin. They grin and they're totally stressed. And you can read the difference between their stress grin and their normal grin. A stress grin, I've seen it usually has bright red cheeks. My daughter does this actually. I shouldn't talk about it, that's not fair. But she does it when she's stressed. Big grin like this and bright red cheeks. And when I see that, I know something's wrong. And you can see it in these kids too, but it looks like I've had people say, well, he looks perfectly happy. No, 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 no. Look at the tightness of that grin. I don't know why they do that, but you do see that a lot, that stress grin. The other thing about social cognition is you adjust your language according to the audience, according to your audience. If I'm sitting with one of my buddies, one of my friends, and we're having a glass of wine, my language is going to be very, very different than it is if I'm in an instructional situation, or when I'm working with children, or when I'm collaborating with my colleagues. All of those situations require different types of language. And for kids naturally learn that difference. They're going to talk differently to their peers, differently to their parents, differently to their teachers, differently to their aunts and uncles. They just learn how to do that. Typical learners just learn it. These autistic kids, you'll find they talk the same to everybody, which is one of the problems they have with socialization, is because they're talking like a little adult, and they're talking to adults on an adult level, and they don't know how to adjust their language to their level. Of course, we had one guy who figured that he wasn't a child. He was 8. He wasn't a child. He was an adult. And he aligned himself with the adults. And he would not align himself with his peers. He didn't want kid friends. He only wanted adult friends. He's the same guy who called me an international terrorist and took off over the soccer field with me running behind him. That, you know, didn't work out so well. He's also a guy. Now, he's in high school. He's at 18 right now, so in his grade 12 year. And at about grade 8, he stopped calling me by my last name. And this is this adult thing, right? Like, he saw himself as an adult from the time he was 8. And he kind of fought against being treated like a kid, because he thought of himself as an adult. By the time he was in grade 8, he started calling me Terry. And I just thought, you know, I've worked for years on trying to get him to see he's a kid. He can call me Terry. I'm gonna let that battle go. Right? It's not that important. So he sees me in the high school, and he's also got these surface. This is the other thing. These guys can kind of fool you a bit when they've got like a script, a social script. He's got a social script. He'll come up to me when he sees me in the high school. Terry, good to see you. Big hug. How are you doing? Nice to see you again. And he does this. Nice to see you again. I hope things are well for you. And off he goes. But that's the end of his social script. If we tried to take it any further, he wouldn't have a lot to give. He would start talking about Muslims or the priesthood, or he's got all these topic perseveration, politics, all these things that he totally perseverates on. And if you engage him too long, he runs out of social script and he goes off onto one of his topics of interest. And so they can sometimes fool you with their script. There's another little guy who's right now 10, and his social script is a little more obvious. Because you say, good morning, how are you? I'm very well, thank you, how are you? And I say, I'm great, how was your weekend? My weekend was very nice, thank you, how was your weekend? He's been taught this script and it's really obvious. But you take it any further and he starts really, he gets real, his behavior starts going wonky and he's hugely sensory.
So is that something that is common, is for people to teach kids the scripts, or are you implying it's negative for them to have a script, or positive?
I think a script is a positive just from the point of view that it can get them through a lot of social situations. Most of the time when we greet kids in the hallway and we say, hey Johnny, how you doing? And they say, I'm doing well, thank you, how are you? I'm doing well, thanks. And off you go. It helps them through those brief social interactions. And the other thing he does is he spins around and he looks right at you when he's doing that. So it looks like he's giving his full attention. And in his heart, he's probably thinking, don't take this any further because this is all I've got. And you almost sense his panic in that. Just keep it short, keep it short. But it does give him a way of getting through those brief social interactions. So, no, I think they're a positive thing in terms of a coping strategy for the kid. But if we want them, it's just the beginning. It's a starting place, right? We do need them. I was going to say something else that I lost. It doesn't really matter. Sensory issues. These guys they have sensory issues. That's one of the features of autism, is sensory issues. Their sensory systems are dysfunctional. They don't work real well. They have problems with filtering out unnecessary sensory stimulus. They have problems with things like background noise, which can drive them buggy. It depends. Their sensory system can be underreactive or overreactive. If it's underreactive, they're going to be sensory seeking. They're going to be looking for more sensory input. If it's an overreactive system, they're going to be highly sensitive to different sensory input. But you can have one sense underreactive and one sense overreactive in the same kid. Just because they've got an overreactive auditory system doesn't mean they have an overactive visual system or an overactive system for smell. So there was one kid I had who was so highly sensitive to smell and actually background noise, but he was seeking out deep pressure, I think. A lot of them seek out deep pressure. You've heard the Temple Grandin movie with the thing she built, the squeeze box that she built. That's a really common need, is that need for deep pressure. It's very calming and soothing for a lot of kids. One of the things, the reason their sensory needs are so important, if they're having their sensory needs met, it can calm them. Sometimes the sensory things that are going on for them are causing them to escalate. And so we really need to look at how do we bring their sensory systems back into alignment so that they can focus. Now the occupational therapists have, they have this, how does your engine run thing? So your system is either over-aroused or under-aroused. We want it to be just right, and somewhere in the middle. So if it's over-aroused, we have to bring it down. If it's under-aroused, we have to bring it up. So we've got one really low guy who has a very, very, very under-aroused system. There is nothing more motivating to him than lying face down on the mat with his hands in his pants. He's got it. So he's got a very, very under-aroused system. So when he's lying on the mat, there is nothing we can do to pull him off it. So we have just had to make a rule. He doesn't lie on the mat. At school, you go home and you lie on the mat all you want. At school, you don't lie down. Because we can't get him up without pulling him to his feet. He's 11 years old. We're not going to be pulling him to his feet when he's 11 years old. The rule is he doesn't lie down at school. We were always told by Pop-Art he needs the breaks, he needs to have that downtime, but it has become such an issue of getting him to his feet that we just had to throw it out. Very under-aroused system. And he's got this fabulous EA who runs around with him and pushes them and gets them running and increases his arousal level, because that's what you need to do with those kids who are so under-aroused. You need to bring them back to a place of enough arousal so they can be ready to learn. And the same with the kids who have an over-aroused sensory system. You have to bring it down to a place where they can be calm enough and ready to learn. And it's really important when you're working with these kids to know if they have an under-aroused system or an over-aroused system and what their sensory needs are. I don't think I put a sensory checklist in your handout, but there are.
There's an autistic boy in my practice class, and he will often, like, he likes to touch and stuff, but when he touches, he'll squeeze really hard. Do they, like, is that a sensory thing, or do they not know how hard they're squeezing?
Well, it's a combination. When they squeeze that hard, like you think about it, they have no perspective taking.
Yeah.
So they don't know that they can hurt someone else. They have no idea. But that's also a deep pressure need.
Right.
Now, often these guys are very huggy. Is it really affection, or is it they're just loving that deep pressure? You know, we have to think. There's often they just are after that deep pressure. They're sensory seeking that deep pressure. Deep pressure is one of those things like the OTs always say. You can't go wrong with giving them meeting deep pressure needs, because chances are they need it. Heavy work, you know, pushing on the wall, lifting things, carrying things. Those all help to calm their systems. One of the things that it's really important to know about the over-arousal and under-arousal and what senses are affected. Oh, my brain just shut down in the middle of that sentence. Oh God, I hate getting old. Over-arousal, under-arousal. Yes, okay, that's what, I had to pull up the specific kid that I was thinking of when I said that. So it's really important to know that, because if you think that they need to calm down when actually they need to be pushed up, you're going to be pushing them down further. So, you know, one size doesn't fit all in terms of sensory strategies. You kind of have to make sure that you're giving them feeding the right sensory need there. And if they are a kid who's hyper-aroused and you're doing things that you think they need that sensory break, they need to run and move, and they're already over-aroused, then you need to do things to bring them down. So it's really important to know what the different things do. Now sometimes that's trial and error, because we're not OTs, we don't know exactly, we can do a checklist, and we can make guesses, and sometimes it's trial and error. Let's take them to the sensory room and see if that helps them run around. Let's take them out on the field and run around, and then they come back in and they're spinning off the walls. Maybe they need calm down. Or you do the calm down thing and they come back and they're half asleep in the classroom. That didn't work. So it's kind of knowing if their system needs to be more engaged or less engaged. The other types of sensory need, the smell and even the taste thing can be real sensory too. The need for crunchy food. One little guy I have, he calms when he's chewing crackers, because the crunchiness is really soothing. And actually that's something even Mel Levine has talked about for years, is the chewing motion can be really calming. Chewing can engage the brain and make kids more ready to learn. It's probably because of the sensory input that they're getting from chewing. He was always a big advocate of gum being allowed. And I mean, I know there's all kinds of issues with gum, but I often throw it out there and see if teachers want to manage gum. But the chewing motion can feed sensory needs, and it can be really helpful to kids in terms of their learning and engaging their brain. The smell thing, some kids, I've had a kid who's been sort of hyper reactive to the smell, and then I've had kids who are seeking smell out. So in a meeting we had the other day, they said it's really embarrassing when they take the kid to this market, because he'll spend all his time at the soaps and perfumes and things just sniffing the, and they're like, are you going to buy something? Like, you've been here for half an hour. Smelling. So there is that, they're either seeking it out or they're really sensitive to it. So one guy, if he smells anything a little different in the class, he's out of the door, because he can't handle any changes in the smells. So this sensory stuff can really really escalate them and change how they're able to learn. And of course, if they're escalated, their executive functioning is important as well. Okay, did I do the flyer? Yes, I did. Okay. Difficulty with transitions. This is something that you pretty much always see with these guys. I shouldn't say always. I've seen some that haven't had too many difficulties with transitions, but that is something that is very, very typical. The isolated play, they can get upset when other students come close or try to share the toys or objects. So the sharing piece they're not so good at. That's that social cognition. They also, they don't recognize that play is about interaction. They don't get that piece. They really see play is about the toys. It's kind of like games too. You play a game with these kids and they lose, and they go sideways Because for them, the only reason you play a game is to win. They don't get that whole piece about play being an interaction time, it's a time to make friends, it's okay not to lose. You know, we can do all the social stories in the world. I worked with some little guy, actually when I was doing private practice, and I worked with him on playing, losing a game. I did social stories, we did practice, I prepared him, I preloaded him, everything. And every time I lost the game, he completely melted down. So one time I'm thinking, okay, I have got like all my ducks in a row. We are working on this, and we worked on it, and he still melted down and went on the couch, and that was it. Like I was only there for 10 minutes, and I had to leave because I lost him so much over this. And then I gave up working on that. Didn't work so well. So the personal space, that they really don't get that personal space thing. They'll either be too close or too far away often. Some of them don't have a problem with that. Like it's very individual. You know, it presents in different ways in different kids. These are just things that could be happening. In circle time, you might see them sitting too close to the other kids, or you might see them always trying to get away from the other kids, getting out of other kids' space. One guy I was watching, he actually wasn't, he was autistic, he was something else. But he had some sort of sensory thing going on, and he had that lack of understanding of social awareness in a lot of ways. But the other kids would be here. The other kids, because he was really impulsive and he had flail, the other kids often got hurt by him. So he would sit in the circle in the middle of a group of kids, and they would all slowly move away. So he always had this kind of cleared area around him, and then he'd shuffle to get closer to kids. And you could see he'd either lean on them, or he's seeking some sort of, not quite contact, but that closeness. I think sensory with that. He's either after the contact or the pressure. I don't think it was social, because he was super engaged in the lesson, but there was something sensory going on there. And then of course the kids are moving away, and he's moving closer, so there's kind of this constant shifting and movement, and it's unconscious. The kids didn't even know they were moving away. He didn't even know he was moving closer. I don't think he had any sense of it. Taking turns and sharing with the social cognition difficulties, of course that's going to be an issue, is the taking turns. They're not going to have that understanding. They can't see things from another person's point of view, so they're going to have difficulties with that taking turns piece. And because of their focus on toys too, and they see toys as being the focus of play rather than the interaction. And it's interesting to watch these guys with other kids, because they really do focus on the toys, and other kids are intruding on their space, and they're just not getting that notion of playing being interactive. We talked about the losing games. Oh, the size of problem thing. They have no sense of a big problem versus a little problem. They will treat someone with a strong smell. Say someone comes in and they've got peanut butter in their lunch and they can't stand the smell of peanut butter. They'll treat that on the same level as they would treat a fire drill or an earthquake. There is no difference in the problem. They have no sense of how big a problem is. Some of them freak out if they drop a pencil. It's just because they don't have any sense of prioritizing. Partly their executive functioning stuff, where they can't prioritize things, and partly just that whole autistic brain, that rigid autistic brain, not able to differentiate between and prioritize what's important, what's not important. Oh, this one, yes. The little policeman of the classroom. They're not following the rules. They can be very, very observant of what the other kids are doing. And again, like, they know that the rules are there. They're trying really hard to be part of the class. And their way of being part of the class is to notice when other kids are not following the rules.
There was a boy who went to our boyfriend's high school, and he actually pretended he was a policeman, he was autistic. And if somebody saw a problem, he'd be like, oh, I don't remember his name, but down the hall I just saw two kids like getting in a fight, and he would like pretend to get into a police car, turn on the sirens, make the sounds, drive up, and then like come and try and like diffuse the problem between the two kids. But he acted like a police man. Yeah. Sometimes they don't they don't totally role play it, but that's basically what they're doing. Yeah, I've seen them try to step in and mediate a problem. Of course, they don't have any problem solving, so it's none of their business. They're just ticking everybody off. Get out of the situation, right? But yeah, they don't know. I've seen them make up rules themselves, make up class rules or game rules, and somehow expect the kids to know the rules, and they get really upset when the kids have broken the rules that have never been said. They just exist in this kid's head, but they don't know. They don't have the perspective taking. I made up the rule. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't know you had to tell people, because you should just know what's going on in my head.
Yes, and this unfair thing, nothing is fair, nothing is fair. This one is one that causes perpetual problems. A little guy and he's not autistic, he's something else, attachment disorder, but he saw it's typical of autistic kids, but it can happen with anyone, where they get really fixated on things being fair. And he saw this hockey team situation as being unfair. He was told, well, you just have to kind of go with it, escalated to a fight where he threw a hockey stick at the teacher, ended up in massive amounts of trouble, but it all started with this situation is unfair. And this is really common for these guys, and it's unfair in their eyes, and it's because they don't have that perspective taking. They don't have the ability to see things from another person's point of view, so they can't see what the other person's needs are and how the other person needs to have a turn and what it looks like from their point of view. So this unfair thing crops up all the time, yeah.
How do you handle a situation with a student like that when sometimes, I mean, you can explain to another student that can get that perspective that sometimes things, that fair isn't always mean equal.
Yeah.
You can explain that to some students. How do you explain that?
Well, in this situation, so the first thing to do, like if you are, this is an incident that happened and you're trying to deal with it.
Yeah.
The first thing you have to do is listen to them.
Yeah.
And the second thing you do is you get them to calm down, because you remember they're up there.
Yeah.
You need them to come back down the other side. And once they're back down the other side, then you can revisit the situation and use visual supports, social stories, comic strip conversations. There's all these strategies you can do to revisit the situation and show them visually how it is. You can't go wrong with visuals. You draw it out. Draw out the situation. Show them why it was fair, what this person saw, what this person saw. And the comic strip conversations, I can go over those later. Those are really powerful for that. But it is about revisiting it after. In the moment, you just listen and you get them to calm down. You bring them down. And that's really, anytime these guys are escalated, all you can do, you listen and you bring them down. And then you deal with it. Then you employ your strategies. I'm a big believer in proactive use of strategies. Reactive tend not to be effective. Proactive are a lot more effective. Frequent interruptions. This was the biggest complaint about one guy I had last year. He was a grade 6 guy. And he was actually on topic. He was one of these kids, I think, he would call himself, he'd say, well, I blurt in class, because he'd been told that. He said, and I get up in people's faces. He knew that was a problem for himself. Could he do anything about it? He has the impulsive brain. No, he couldn't do anything about it. He tried really hard. This drove teachers absolutely crazy. This constant talking from him in the class, it drove them buggy. They're trying to teach a lesson. And often he was responding to what the teacher was saying. So he was on topic. He was responding to what the teacher was saying. Or because he was desperate to have friends, and often these autistic kids are desperate to have friends and they just go about it so wrong. He was really observant of what all the kids were doing. So he might be commenting on what someone else is doing. Or policing somebody, you know, you're breaking the rules. But he didn't have, it was really hard for him to understand. I think the basic understanding was not there of this is what a classroom is supposed to look like. This is what you are supposed to do in the classroom. And he knew he did it, and he knew it was wrong, but he didn't really get it, internalize it enough to be able to control it effectively. So there was a lot of work to be done with him. I didn't have the school this year, so we didn't continue it, but we were just really starting with him. And one of the things I did was I went in and I observed him and counted the number of blurts that he did. And I said to him, okay, this is how many blurts you did this time. We're going to try and bring it down, and this is how we're going to do it, blah, blah, blah. And he said, that many, and it was a big mistake because he just spiraled down. He got so upset with himself for having that many blurts in the class. And I was trying to show him a starting place so we could show him reducing it. All it did was to make him really, really upset. So. And again, when they're not chosen for a turn, it's, again, a lot of this comes back to perspective taking. So they think, they really don't understand what fair means, that everybody gets a turn, or that in class, sometimes 5 people will get a turn. And you might not be one of those 5 people that get a turn. The rest of the class can kind of get that, and maybe next time they'll get a turn. They cannot accept that because it's so important for them to get a turn. Now, initially, we kind of have to give them the turn until we've teach them the skills how to not get a turn. That's how I would deal with that one, is you just make sure they get a turn until they've learned how not to get a turn. And I think the other kids will react to that, but again, it goes back to how do we explain to the other kids, because sometimes they need explanation too. Then the favorite topic, and talking incessantly, this is that topic perseveration. When they have an interest, they tend to get so focused on one interest, which you probably know about autism. You know, the trains, the Titanic. Those are really big ones for some reason. They love the Titanic, they love the trains. You always hear those ones. And they just go on and on and on about it. Dinosaurs, actually one guy, what was he into? It was something really bizarre. It was some specific type of flying mammal or something that he couldn't stop talking about. I don't know. And the correction. This is another thing that makes people crazy. Actually, my nephew is slightly autistic. He's on the spectrum. This one drives my mom, who's 91. This drives her crazy. Like, as you get old too, I think your executive functioning diminishes. And I see it in her. You know, she's the most wonderful lady in the world. But she doesn't have the executive functioning that she used to. She's very much like your dear old grandma lady. She's lovely, lovely. But when my nephew does this makes her crazy. She cannot handle it. So he's there saying, well, actually, you know, we actually left at 1:36, not 1:34. So if you were to check the clock, she's like, I don't care what time it was. But that's the kind of thing that they get very, very detail-oriented, very, very specific. You know, you said the weather was rainy, but actually it was only drizzling a little bit, and it was really, really windy. That would have been a more accurate description of what the weather was, Grandma. Grandma goes, it's not nice to make a 91-year-old angry. The very literal kids. This goes back to a lot of the language processing and the executive functioning piece. They do not make inferences. Their inferential thinking is really weak. They are very literal. We have to avoid the kind of metaphorical language, the idioms. They're not getting it. They can't wrap their head around it. We can teach them those things. Idioms are weird though, like you kind of have to teach them one at a time. But you have to be aware when you're using these things, or if words, multiple meaning words, that have two different meanings, they can really throw these guys, because they're not necessarily using the context to figure out the meaning. They might be able to, if you said to them, okay, I'm using it this way, then it has a different meaning. They might be able to pull that out. Sometimes the word has one meaning and one meaning only, and they don't have the flexibility to allow other meanings for that word. So that's something to really be aware of with them. They're easily misinterpret what you're saying. And sometimes with these guys, we need to figure out why they're misinterpreting it in order to be able to help them better. They can often feel their reactions are justified. Well, of course I was going to get angry because they were playing the game wrong. And it's not my fault I got angry, it's their fault. So that they can see it that way. But I've also seen these guys feel tremendous remorse. And the reason for the remorse is because they hit the top of the scale, they lose it, they trash the room, they do whatever, and when they come down, they look around and go, oh my God, look what I did. I can't believe I did this, because they know it's wrong to do that. They know it's wrong to damage a computer. They know it's wrong to trash the room. So their remorses can be really extreme.
Do you think it's possible for some of these behaviors to be learned behaviors? So I'll explain that. Is that a girl in my class last year, she was being tested to see if she was on the spectrum, but she had two older brothers who are on the spectrum. And so then there was a question of her behaviors and the way she acts being because she's kind of around it all the time, and that's not my opinion. That was given to me from kind of the teacher in the school-based team. They were wondering if that was
I think that's a theory to throw out there and explore, but I don't think we want to make that assumption. I think we need to tease that out. It could be, I think, to a certain degree, but ultimately, if they are doing these autistic type behaviors, and they're not autistic, they probably, when you think about it, they have perspective taking. And they know how other people are perceiving them. The autistic people don't have perspective taking. They don't know how other people are perceiving them. So it doesn't matter to them, because they don't get it, right? If she is doing these behaviors and she has perspective taking, and she's gonna read the effect that she's having on others, and she's not going to continue. If she's continuing with the behaviors, you kind of wonder, like, that sounds more like autism. Because if she has perspective taking, she's not going to do it. That would be my take on it.
Yeah. And I wasn't there to see kind of the end result of it, so I'm not too sure, but.
Right, right. Yeah, I think I hear that a lot, you know, even with the speech things, like this little girl that I'm working with right now, her older brother had very severe speech problem, and he's got very severe epilepsy too, and is no longer able to attend school because of his epilepsy. And I didn't get anywhere with his speech, and I think because his brain was getting damaged progressively from the seizures. But the little girl comes in, and her speech is a lot like her brother's, with the exception that she's making progress. But she's making progress because she's not getting the damage in the brain, right? So the first comment from the mom on the referral form was, well, she's only speaking this way because of her brother. I disagree. I disagree. I think if modeling was solely responsible for a lot of these things we see, it should be a lot easier to fix. You know, a girl without autism should be able to learn how to manage the situations.
I was going to ask how you respond to those kids who show great remorse after lashing out. Because on one hand, you understand they can't help it and your heart sort of breaks for them. But on the other, if they, you know,
Well,
violent or what do you kind of...
This comes down to, we do want them to understand that in society, you cannot be doing this. You sort of a two-pronged, like there's several ways that you have to deal with that. You know, in society, and you have to think of it, what lesson do I want them to learn from this? I'm not a big advocate of punishment. Punishment does not change behavior, but I think they need to know what will happen to them if they don't learn the strategies that we're going to teach them to manage their behavior. So they need to see the results of this. We need to map it out visually for them, what's going to happen now. And the kid who damaged the computer, he had to give up his allowance to give to the person whose computer he damaged. And it wasn't a big amount of money. It didn't make it, she put it in a jar for the food supply in the school or whatever. That wasn't the point. The point is, when you hit this point, when you peak, a 5 on the 5-point scale, there is going to be consequences in society, and you have to know this is going to happen. So you have to think of it as a lesson and a teaching thing for them. We're not going to change his behavior through punishment, but it is letting him know another reason to learn why these strategies are so important. So that's why we had him give up his allowance for it. But it was really heartbreaking to see. He ended up on the floor, sobbing, curled up in a ball. I can't believe what I did. It was awful. Okay, so, you know, obviously you guys are seeing the relationship between these three things. Language processing problems can exist without executive functioning problems and without autism. You can have a kid who's got pretty much language processing problems. Their academics will be affected, but they don't have to have executive functioning problems. Kids with executive functioning problems, they don't have to have ASD, they don't have to have any diagnosable condition, they can just have executive functioning problems. But they do generally have some sort of language processing problem, even if it is just processing and understanding and using abstract language. And I often see this with kids who have executive functioning problems, that's where it is, yeah.
How do they diagnose, like what are the steps you go through to diagnose autism?
Autism?
Yeah, like how do you know if it's just an executive functioning problem?
Okay.
But they don't have autism, or if they do have it.
Okay, so somebody has to notice the characteristics of autism in the child. So often in the school, sometimes in the preschool years they'll be noticed. So you see these characteristics, you see the executive function, you see the stereotype behaviors, the rigidity, and all that kind of thing. When they notice it, then you have to. What we do, I'll tell you what we do in school. It's a little different for preschool, but in school, they would need a speech and language assessment, because that is part of the diagnosis. They would need, we also do this thing that they don't require, but I think they should. There's a checklist, and it's called the SASE, and I don't even remember what it stands for. Screening Assessment for something high-functioning autism in school-age students, I don't know. And it's a checklist that you do with the teacher and the parent that goes through all the characteristics of autism. And that checklist helps to determine whether or not a referral onto a pediatrician is appropriate. The next step is that parents take any assessment information from the school and anecdotal observations from the teacher and anyone at the school are really, really valuable. So they take the anecdotal information, they take this package from the school, they go to their family doctor and ask for a referral to the pediatrician. There's a lot of places that process can get blocked along the way. One is if the family doctor says they don't have autism and I'm not referring you. So then the parent has to be strong enough to say, I demand a referral to a pediatrician. So then they get to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician can say, I don't believe that your child has autism. I've talked to him for 5 minutes and I know he doesn't have autism. Despite this package of documents from the school. And in which case, and we did have that happen with one kid who was like so autistic, it was just ridiculous, and the pediatrician said no. And so she just kept going back and helping the pediatrician until the pediatrician said, fine, I'll refer him, but they're not even going to assess him because he's so not autistic. Well, of course they assessed him, and of course he was autistic because it was obvious that he was autistic. I mean, you actually could tell in a conversation with him. But this pediatrician had this weird idea about the whole process. So the next thing is, the pediatrician sends in the referral package, and then they go to a central place. Now, in Nanaimo, it's the Child Development Center. They have the CDBC, it's Complex Developmental Behavior Conditions. It's the same process for FAS assessment, FAS diagnosis, and it is supposedly a team of professionals who diagnose the child, supposedly including the pediatrician, the speech and language pathologist, and the psychologist. In reality, what happens in Nanaimo, and I don't think we're doing it right in Nanaimo, I think that they're supposed to have the speech and language. I've seen kids diagnosed who don't even have a speech and language assessment, and that's actually, they could lose their diagnosis for that. But it's supposed to have those 3 professionals involved in it. In reality, it's a psychologist who makes the diagnosis in Nanaimo. I think it's different in Queen Alexandra, it's different in Comox and Courtney. I think Comox and Courtney is all, Comox Valley is all over the right process. But here, I think we've got some gaps going on. But that's the process. So it is a medical diagnosis. It has to go through the medical process system. There's all these roadblocks that can happen on the way. Right now in Nanaimo, there's like a 2 or 3 year wait list to get the diagnosis. So once the paperwork arrives it actually goes to Victoria first and then Nanaimo. Once it arrives in Nanaimo, you've still got a 2 or 3 year wait list. And getting to a pediatrician could be 6 months. So it's nice when you get the information done quickly, but at the same time, I look at these kindergarten kids who look kind of autistic in kindergarten, and it could be they just need time. Are we going to really rush this? But what if they, by the time they're in grade 3, although I guess you could pull out of the process, but then you're also working through acceptance with the parents and helping the parents to see that those behaviors are there. And often the parents aren't seeing it. We've got one guy who could probably use an assessment, could probably do an assessment. He's very questionable. But the parents keep saying he's not doing it at home, he's not doing it at home. But they never are at school. He doesn't have friends, so he doesn't play with other kids. He plays just fine with his younger sister, but they're not seeing it because they don't see him in that intense social situation in the school.
Now with autism, does the specific type that they have make a difference where the medical diagnosis is necessary if it's taking that long to process? Or can all of these strategies we talked about be things that we as teachers can be implementing right away that will start helping them in the classroom?
You could implement them at any time.
So it doesn't really matter what they have or what the diagnosis is. We should just be starting to do these things right away.
Yeah. Understanding having the diagnosis is not as important as understanding that it's neurological, they can't help it, and recognizing the reasons for that specific behavior. And the reasons even in that moment. Like, if we know that they always get really antsy at the end of circle time and they need a break, we're going to give them a break regardless if they got a diagnosis or not.
And is there any way you could do something for one type of autism? Could you do something wrong?
For autism?
For one type of autism that could mess up if it was a different...
Well, they don't actually, the only differentiation they make now in different types of autism is level 1, 2, or 3.
Right. So a medical diagnosis, you couldn't
No.
You can screw something up depending on without that diagnosis.
No, you're not going to change anything. The only thing that you could potentially cause problems with is if you expected they had more abilities, if you assumed and expected that they had more ability than they did.
Okay.
Because then your expectations are higher and you're going to increase their anxiety.
Right.
But basically the strategies are really similar because of the way their brain is wired. What you're gonna see with the strategies that I go over with you is that it doesn't matter if it's language processing, autism, FAS, whatever they are, the strategies that apply to all. You cannot go wrong with visual strategies. You generally cannot go wrong if you think they have sensory issues. You generally can't go wrong with some deep pressure, some heavy lifting, those kinds of activities. And that's what the OT told. So I'm repeating it to you as gospel because an OT said it to me. There's all kinds, you can Google heavy lifting, you can Google deep pressure activities, there's all kinds of them that you can even implement within a classroom. Like some people do the wall push-ups. Some people have like a big ball in the class they can roll around for a bit, or a medicine ball or something. Like people try to incorporate as much as possible. There's a lot of, I think there's high expectations sometimes that teachers will have all these wonderful sensory things going on in the class for them, but I think you're limited in what you can provide in the class, but there's still a lot that you can do for sensory stuff in the classroom. And it is about understanding things like the specific sensory need, like do they need to carry a little bag with a scented thing in it to sniff it because that calms their system when they can get a strong smell, or do we need to get them kind of isolated a little from the other kids because they can't handle people too close into their place. Like it is understanding what their specific need is, but it isn't as much about the diagnosis as understanding the kind of the little pieces of who they are. So the students with ASD always have executive functioning problems of some sort, and they mostly, I haven't seen one that doesn't have language processing problems. They just look a little different. The one guy I assessed, actually the guy who felt remorse and wrecked the computer and all that kind of stuff, when I assessed him, he performed really well in the test, and that's a real typical thing too. Until I did a test that I have called the Social Language Development Test, and he kind of bombed on it, because that's about reading social situations. But what he had problems with, especially on the social language one, was the inferential thinking, the problem solving, understanding other people's point of view, and all the social language used in those situations. Part of the thing is, these guys are kind of hard to figure out their language processing piece if they're at the top end of the spectrum, because they can be highly verbal, and they've got a lot of kind of intellectual skills and intellectual abilities in terms of being able to talk their way through things. And it can be really hard to make your tests prove something about their language processing, is what I find. But when you're interacting with them, you know they're not processing language quickly. You know they're not processing it accurately. You know they're misreading the language. You know they're literal. Our tests don't necessarily pick it up. Executive functioning is always associated with FAS, and just in anxiety too, you have to remember when somebody's highly anxious, it doesn't mean they don't have the ability to use their executive functioning. It just means that the anxiety has hijacked their executive functioning skills. So the anxiety shuts down their thinking brain, and we have to wait till they bring it back before we can, so that's the calming piece, before we can really do anything about the situation that can increase their anxiety. Some kids, and they don't have to be on the spectrum, but a lot of kids do come into school at the start of the day in a really escalated state for whatever reason. For some people, like a lot of autistic kids, the school is such a stressful place to be for many of these guys. It's intensely social. The rules change. There's rules, but they change, and not everybody follows the rules. And they don't have to have issues at home to find walking in the door of the building really, really stressful. And a lot of times when we talk about that, I find that the school is ready to say, well, you know, they've got problems at home. It must be coming from home, this anxiety. Or they'll say, well, everything's fine at home. Why would they be walking in the door escalated? The fact is, coming into such an intensely social place, day after day, is really difficult for these guys. And they know it's going to be hard. They don't get it. They don't know the social stuff. Yeah, they can do the academics, but school is really minimally about academics in a lot of ways. So, the anxiety is one of the pieces of autism that is pretty pervasive. In fact, I don't know that I have ever seen a child with autism who doesn't have anxiety. There's some statistic that like 80% of them have anxiety, but I think, like I said, I've never seen one without it. They are anxious people. Language processing problems often go hand in hand with other things, but not always. A language processing problem can exist all by itself in isolation. You can get these kids who don't have executive functioning problems, but their language processing is really, really weak. The little girl with the word retrieval problems, I don't think there's anything wrong with her executive functions. She certainly isn't autistic, she's highly social. She certainly doesn't have any other condition. She's not FAS because she's got too many skills. But she does have a fairly massive language processing problem. So I think that in her it's existing all by itself. So what I want to do now, if you can give me like 5 minutes to find my video clips, is that okay?